World Affairs, 1945. Up to the moment of writing, 2 of these bombs have been dropped. The first of them completely wiped out more than 4 square miles of a Japanese city and is said to have killed about 50,000 people. It was a bomb weighing less than 500 pounds, and of a type already described as out of date. Although atomic energy may prove to be of great value to man, its first introduction to the public has been in the shape of a bomb, and it is hardly necessary to point out what the discovery of this terrible weapon means to the human race. It may be a turning point in history as important as the invention of the steam engine. At present, the process of making the bomb is a secret and is only known fully in the United States, but researchers along similar lines have been proceeding elsewhere, and we may be sure that before long at least 3 nations, probably more, will possess the means of blowing one another to pieces. Only a few hundred such bombs, dropped on great cities and on important industrial areas, could push us back into conditions of primitive savagery. This is all the more reason why every person who can read and think should interest himself in political affairs. Wars do not happen because of simple wickedness. They result from jealousies and frictions over markets, over boundaries, over raw materials, over national minorities, which can be removed if we put our minds to it. To understand where the world is going and what can be done to prevent disaster is, above all, the concern of the young, because the future belongs to them. To make sure that there is never another war is even more important to someone who is now 16 than it is to someone of 60. The article that follows is an attempt to describe the actual state of the world and the immediate problems that face us. It sets out to show that these problems can be solved, but at the same time, it emphasizes that there is not much cause for optimism in the world today. While I write this, the leaders of the Big Three are still conferring in Potsdam, and we have not, as yet, been told anything about the decisions that they may have reached. However, it is possible to make a good guess at what subjects they are discussing. To do so, one has only to stop and think what has happened to the world as a result of 6 years of war. The first thing that has happened is that the world, by and large, is very much poorer. Most of its inhabitants are living, and will be living for years to come, at a much lower level of comfort than they enjoyed in 1939. The most obvious cause of this is the actual physical destruction. In Germany, every big town that was within reach of the British and American bombers has been wrecked in a way that even we, in England, badly bombed though we were, do not find it easy to imagine. Whole areas which once housed hundreds of thousands of people have been reduced to piles of plaster and broken bricks. German industry has perhaps not been smashed beyond repair, but it will certainly need many years of building before the German people have enough houses to live in. And this destruction has not only happened in Germany, but also in Poland, Italy, parts of Austria, Hungary, and Greece, and in a large and important area of Soviet Russia. Wherever there has been ground fighting, the destruction has been even worse than what was caused by the bombing planes. Coal mines have been flooded, machinery has been smashed up or looted, locomotives and railway trucks have been destroyed in tens of thousands. One gets some idea of the work of repair that will have to be done if one realizes, for instance, that between Paris and Berlin there is hardly a single bridge that has not been blown up. But perhaps more important than the mere destruction is the fact that in wartime many kinds of necessary work are neglected. Every scrap of steel and every ounce of labor has to be used in the manufacture of weapons, which means not only that it is impossible to supply the public with such things as motor cars, watches, typewriters, refrigerators, and wireless sets, but that machinery is not replaced unless it is of a kind to be useful to the war effort. Outside the range of the fighting, the amount of industrial plant may and probably does increase. It has certainly increased to an enormous extent in the United States, for instance, but it is all designed for war purposes and cannot be switched over at a moment's notice. Factories which were built to make tanks, machine guns, shell cases, and camouflage nets cannot start the next morning to make saucepans, vacuum cleaners, window frames, and sewing machines. And meanwhile, all of those things are in very short supply. War means taking millions of people away from productive work for years on end, and, somehow or other, the lost labor has to be made up. There is also the loss of life, and the huge displacement of populations, which will take years to smooth out. We have no accurate information as to how many people have been killed in battle or in air raids, or have been massacred, or have died in the various famines caused by the war. But it is unlikely that they number less than 20 millions. That is, about 1% of the population of the world. Besides this, in various parts of Asia and Europe, millions or tens of millions of people have been uprooted from their homes and dumped down somewhere else to begin life anew. The Germans transported at least 7 million people, mostly Russians and Poles, in order to use them for forced labor on the land or in industry. Most of them are now finding their way home again, but merely to move them is an enormous undertaking. About 2 million Germans are in process of being expelled from Czechoslovakia, and millions more have been or will be expelled from East Prussia to make way for the Poles. At the same time, large numbers of Poles, previously deported by the Russians, are moving back into Poland, and others are moving out of the eastern provinces of Poland, which the USSR has now taken over. One must remember that most of these people who have been shifted to and fro are peasants who cannot take their farm machinery and their animals with them when they move. Nearly every European country now has in it masses of homeless, destitute people, and how to feed them is a formidable problem. Not only because food is none too plentiful anywhere, but still more because of the shortage of shipping and the all-round damage to communications. So the two countries which have been least damaged by the war, that is, the USA and Britain, will have to put their main energies to repairing the world. We know, therefore, without needing to be told, what is the most urgent of the problems now being discussed in Potsdam. It is simply this: how to prevent millions of people in Europe from dying of hunger and cold during this coming winter. And beyond that lies the yet bigger problem of cleaning up the mess. Tens of millions of houses have to be built, hundreds of sunken ships replaced, wrecked coal mines and oil wells put in working order, war industries converted to peaceful purposes, agricultural machinery manufactured and distributed, and trade set flowing again between the continents. And all this after 6 years of destruction and waste. For several years, nearly every country in the world will have to go on living in what are more or less wartime conditions. Industry will still have to be controlled by the state. Food and clothes will still have to be rationed. Travel will be restricted, and long working hours will be the rule. There is not likely to be much unemployment in the years immediately following the war, because there will be no difficulty in finding markets for such goods as can be produced and transported. Every kind of commodity, coal, oil, cloth, rubber, timber, machinery, is desperately needed by some country or other. and the main difficulties in the way of international trade will be first the lack of transport, and secondly the fact that the countries hardest hit by the war will have no goods to export. Perhaps in 5 years from the ending of the war with Japan, the world will be reasonably prosperous again, and it is then that certain changes which have been happening under the surface from 1939 onwards will begin to make themselves felt. One thing which the war has proved is that neither small nor large nations can be fully independent. Even when they are able to support themselves in an economic sense, they are utterly unable to defend themselves against an outside attack. During the past 6 years, a whole string of small nations, Belgium, Yugoslavia, Denmark, Iran, Norway, and others, have been overrun by some great power, usually only after a few days fighting, and even countries of the size of France and Italy were unequal to making war on a big scale. To be able to make war, you have to be able to turn out highly complicated weapons, such as tanks and aeroplanes, in enormous numbers, which means that only those countries which have big reserves of industrial plant, skilled labor, and raw materials can be powerful in a military sense. In the 19th century, wars were still fought with crude weapons which could be manufactured anywhere. Military power was therefore a matter of numbers, and 10 small nations, whose combined populations added up to 100 millions, were, at any rate potentially, stronger than one great nation of 50 millions. Today, most of the small nations are unable to produce modern weapons, even in small quantities. High-speed aeroplanes, or large-caliber guns, or pieces of armor plate big enough for battleships can only be produced in the main industrial areas, of which there are about a dozen in the whole world. It follows that every small nation has to live under the protection, and to some extent under the control, of some big nation, usually its nearest neighbor. Poland or Finland, for instance, cannot remain even partially independent unless they keep on good terms with Russia. Belgium and Holland have to be protected by Britain and France, or both. The South American countries could and would be conquered by the Japanese or by some European power if they were not guarded by the United States. All this was known, in a sort of way, before the guns started firing in 1939, but the war has emphasized it. For the war has not only brought out the weakness of the small powers, it has also changed the attitude of the great powers. Not merely Germany and Japan, but Britain, Russia, and the United States have, on a number of occasions, invaded small countries without provocation, or have interfered in their internal affairs in a way that few people would have approved of 10 years ago. They have been compelled to do so, because otherwise these small countries could have been used as bases of attack against themselves. As a result of the war, all of the great powers have become less scrupulous about respecting neutrality and less inclined to tolerate hostile governments on their borders. The present tendency is for the world to be cut up into what are called zones of influence, with one big country all-powerful within each zone. Therefore, again without being told, we can make a good guess at another of the subjects now being debated in Potsdam. It is, can the 3 great victors of the war administer the world as a single unit, or must it be permanently split up into 3 zones of influence? And if so, where are the boundaries of those zones to be drawn? Before the war, there were 7 nations which were usually described as great powers: the United States, Britain, Soviet Russia, Germany, France, Italy, and Japan. Now only the first 3 of these remain. France has been greatly weakened, and Italy even more so. Germany's military power has been broken for a long time to come, and Japan's as well, and China, in spite of its vast, hard-working population, is still too backward to exert any power outside its own borders or even to defend itself unaided. India is even more backward than China. For the time being, 3 nations are supreme, and the kind of future that is before us depends on whether they choose to cooperate or to remain rivals. If we face the facts, we must realize that the chances are against any genuine organization for world control being set up at this moment. For quite 2 years, all the signs have pointed in the other direction. The 3 great powers differ very greatly in outlook and tradition, and when they have recovered from the war, their material interests will clash as well. By considering the special position of each of the big 3, its social and economic system, its resources, and its weaknesses, one can get a good idea of the difficulties that are likely to arise. Of the 3 great powers, Britain is the weakest. Its population is only 46 million, and within its own borders, it has no large supply of any raw material except coal. This means that Britain has to live largely on imported goods, which, in the long run, have to be paid for by exports. But because for 6 years it was compelled to use all its energy in producing weapons of war, Britain has lost most of its overseas markets and has failed to modernize its industries. During the period when war damage is being repaired, Britain will be able to sell anything it can produce, but after that, it may be unable to compete with the bigger and more efficient industries of the United States. Without a steady flow of imports and exports, Britain could not keep its navy and air force at the necessary level of efficiency, and might not even be able to survive as an independent nation. But to set against this, Britain has several great advantages. One is the possession of air and sea bases at important strategic spots such as Gibraltar and Aden. Another is the adherence of the English-speaking dominions, which are not controlled by Britain but linked to it in a sort of permanent alliance. Britain's colonial possessions in Asia and Africa are a more doubtful asset. They provide a market for manufactured goods and pay for them with valuable products such as rubber, rice, and tin, but in time of war they have to be defended, and the natural desire of their inhabitants for independence makes for constant political friction. By far the biggest of Britain's possessions, India, is likely to become independent in the fairly near future, and after a few years of readjustment, the results will probably be beneficial to Britain. Britain has another, less obvious, but still real advantage in its democratic tradition, which allows it to make great changes without bloodshed and gives it a certain moral authority among the Western European nations. Of the 3 great powers, Britain has the most to gain by international cooperation, and, above all, it cannot afford to quarrel with the United States. Soviet Russia has the advantage of a huge and growing population and of unlimited resources of every kind of raw material inside its own territories. Its great size and poor communications make it a difficult country to invade successfully, and it is able to place its most important industries in areas where they cannot be bombed. Its economic system, in which everything is planned and controlled by the state, makes it possible to carry through huge reconstruction schemes, such as the first and second 5-year plans, and to modernize agriculture and create new industries at short notice. It is therefore easy for Soviet Russia to control the governments and the policies of all the countries of Eastern Europe and of certain Asiatic countries as well. From the point of view of a peasant who is overworked and permanently in debt, The Russian system means a very great improvement, and it is natural for the populations of the poorer European countries to look towards Russia for leadership. At the moment, however, the Russians have been greatly weakened and impoverished by the war. One of their best industrial areas has been devastated, and to get their agriculture on its feet again, they will need quantities of tractors and other farm machinery which will have to be procured from the United States. Alone among the big countries of the world, the United States has not suffered seriously from the war, indeed, has grown vastly stronger because of it. The industrial power of the United States is so enormous that it has been able to take the major share in 2 wars and, at the same time, maintain its own people at a standard of living that no other country could dream of. With existing weapons, the United States cannot be directly attacked. No other power can build ships or planes in competition with it, and, during the war, it has acquired new sea and air bases all over the Atlantic and Pacific. The one great disability from which it suffers is the lack of a strong central government, which often allows its policies to be controlled by irresponsible businessmen. After the last war, the Americans threw away their chance of becoming the leaders of the world by refusing to enter the League of Nations. This time, they will not make precisely the same mistake, but they may make the equally bad one of refusing to cooperate with other powers in the matter of tariffs or of air transport. When one considers the existing differences between the 3 great powers, one sees that it is not easy for them to combine in a single organization for the reconstruction of the world. But if they do not do so, if they remain as separate, sovereign states, they are bound to be in constant friction with one another. Zones of influence are a very poor solution because zones inevitably overlap. The British, for example, want a secure sea route to India and Australia, and therefore want control of the Mediterranean. The Russians want control of the Dardanelles. And if you look at the map, you can see a dozen places at which the interests of the great powers are bound to clash. For example, Persia, Afghanistan, and Manchuria. If the great states are unready to give up some of their national sovereignty, then they are bound to develop into enemies of one another. That does not mean that there will immediately be another war. No belligerent nation is able or willing to fight another big-scale war at this moment. But it does mean that there will be first a scramble to secure as big a zone of influence as possible, and then a tightening up of frontiers which will make trade and intercommunication on a worldwide scale impossible. The world will split into 3 camps, and ultimately into 2, for Britain, not strong enough to stand alone, will become a part of the American system. The smaller nations will be grouped about the bigger ones, on lines which it is already possible to draw with fair accuracy. Something of the kind has already happened in occupied Europe, where the Russian and the Anglo-American zones are divided by a no-man's land, which makes it impossible to exchange either goods or ideas. The leaders of the Big Three will have been discussing other topics besides those I have raised. They will have been discussing, for example, the war with Japan, and what to do with the German armament factories, and what to demand in the way of reparations. But their 2 most urgent and most difficult problems will be how to feed Europe and where to draw its frontiers. The answer to the first may affect the lives of millions, but there is not a human being on the face of the earth whose future will not be affected by the answer to the second. The days are gone when the world could consist of a patchwork of small and genuinely independent states. The choice is between a single world organization and the survival of 2 or 3 giant states, all more or less hostile to one another. We do not yet know which alternative will prevail, but we can have a good idea what each of them would mean. The happiness of ordinary people everywhere is bound up with the first, and it is for them to use their votes, their voices, and any other influence they have to bring it into being.